going to think about anxiety this morning because we're going to see a situation that certainly would have produced tremendous anxiety for David. All right, here's the incident. A messenger came and told David, "The hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom." Absalom was one of David's sons. Then David said to all his officials who were with him in Jerusalem, "Come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will quickly move to overtake us and bring ruin upon us and put the city to the sword." The whole countryside wept aloud as all the people passed by. The king also crossed the Kidron Valley, and all the people moved on toward the desert. Zadok, the high priest, was there too, and all the Levites who were with him were carrying the ark of the covenant of God. And they set down the ark of God, and Abiathar offered sacrifices until all the people had finished leaving the city. Then the king said to Zadok, "Take the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it in his dwelling place again. But if he says, 'I am not pleased with you,' then I am ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him." So Zadok and Abiathar took the ark of God back to Jerusalem and stayed there. But David continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered, and he was barefoot. And all the people with him covered their heads too, and were weeping as they went up. All right, that's the incident. And it takes place, as I said, late in David's life. And David's story, as you know, is a complicated one, brought on by some of his bad choices in life, we know, and also by his decision to marry multiple wives. You know, it says in Deuteronomy, the king, one of the laws of God in the book of Deuteronomy, the king should not have many wives, multiple wives. They did. They weren't supposed to, but they did. And the trouble that it brought on David. Here's the story that leads to Absalom. One of Absalom's half-brothers, a man named Amnon, raped Absalom's sister. These are David's children by different wives. And so Absalom wreaks vengeance on Tamar, on Amnon rather, in honor of his sister Tamar, and kills Amnon. And so then David banishes Absalom, banishes him from the city, and humiliates him. Instead of trying to see the injustice that was done first, trying to see both sides, David reacts, and Absalom is banished and humiliated. Absalom seethes with rage over time, and eventually he decides to overthrow his father, and he gathers an army together and moves on Jerusalem. That's the incident in the background. Here's the response, and this is found, as I said, in Psalm 62. Written later as David reflects on it. "My soul finds rest in God alone. My salvation comes from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken. How long will you assault a man? Would all of you throw him down this leaning wall, this tottering fence? They fully intend to topple him from his lofty place. They take delight in lies. With their mouths they bless, but in their hearts they curse. Find rest, O my soul, in God alone. My hope comes from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will not be shaken. My salvation and my honor depend on God. He is my mighty rock, my refuge. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your hearts to him, for God is our refuge. Low men are but a breath. The highborn are but a lie. If weighed in a balance, they are nothing. Taken together, they are only a breath. Do not trust in extortion or take pride in stolen goods. Though your riches increase, do not set your heart on them. One thing God has spoken, two things have I heard, that you, O God, are strong, and that you, O Lord, are loving. Surely you will reward each person according to what he has done. All right, let's reflect on this, and let me just pray for you and pray for me. Lord, I pray that the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts would be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Be our teacher this morning. In your name, amen. All right, let's look at this. I want to make three reflections, as I said. And I've got some words that will help you remember. Face your fears. Face the anxieties that come to us. That's what David does in this passage. Let me just show you that. You know, sometimes we live in denial. We think maybe that leak in the roof is not going to continue, right? Always does. Or that noise we hear in the front end of the car, it's going to go away after a while. Well, it never does. We deny sometimes the fears that we face, the anxieties. We say, that's just life. It's just life, it's stress. And sometimes it is, sometimes that's all it is. But sometimes it's not. And sometimes it's a sign that there's something going on. It's like one of the lights that come on your dashboard. Mostly it's just maintenance required or, oil change needed, whatever. But once in a while, if you have an older car like I do, my old pickup truck, a light comes on that you better pay attention to. It's a warning. A couple months ago, earlier in the summer, the light came on. It was the battery icon. I've never seen the battery icon come on before. And all of a sudden, I knew we had a problem. I could see the engine temperature just soaring, the gauge going up. And so I did what my father told me in the old days. If you start to overheat, what do? You roll down your windows, turn the AC off if you have it, turn the heat on full blast, right? Remember that? Do they teach young people that anymore? Well, cars don't fail today the way they used to. Anyway, and so I did that, and then all of a sudden I realized the engine had boiled over. I was only a few miles from home. I got home, shut it off, had it towed. It was the water pump had gone on it, had ruined the serpentine belt, and the whole thing had just shut down. Fortunately, I was able to keep going, but that was a warning. I had to pay attention. I could have kept going. Fortunately, I didn't have to, but that was a warning. Stop, or you're going to burn this engine up pretty quickly, because I'd lost all the coolant. Sometimes we live in denial. Sometimes we give advice to people who are anxious. We say, don't worry. That's one of the least helpful things I think that we can say to people. I am worried. Telling me not to worry is not going to help me. I'm worried. You're not in my situation. The old saying, minor surgery is what other people have, right? It's not what you have. That's major surgery. And so we give advice to people. Don't worry. Be happy. Here's a little song I wrote. Let me sing it note for note. Don't worry. Be happy. But that's not helpful. We need to face the fears. When we're feeling anxious, pay attention to it. Listen to it. It may very well be God saying something is seriously wrong. It may be just, we all feel some anxiety when we're trying to do a good job. That's just a sign that you're careful, that you care about things, that you're conscientious, that you're trying to work hard to, I felt a little anxiety as I woke up this morning because I want to do a good job for the Lord. I want to do a good job for you and for Justin. And so that's noise level. That's normal. That's part of life. I'm talking about something deeper and darker. And we face it. We need to face it. We're not having much of a baseball season this year, unfortunately. But if you're a baseball fan and you remember these things, you might remember a pitcher, a National League pitcher named Dave Dravecky. He pitched actually about, over 30 years ago, back in the late 80s, almost 40 years ago. And he played for the San Francisco Giants. And he was up-and-coming pitcher, left-hander. He was at the height of his career at age 32. And the Giants were headed for the playoffs. And he was pitching. And his arm got really, really sore. And so they took him out of the game, and they later examined and realized he had a cancerous lump on his arm. And they said, your career is over, Dave Dravecky. Done. Well, surgery moved the lump. In the off-season, he worked really hard, and he came back. And he actually made it back the following year. And in the meantime, he had become a follower of Jesus Christ. And everybody was hailing this as a miracle, an answer to prayer, an answer to faith. And he was pitching in his first game back, middle of the season, and he had thrown about 3 pitches, and then all of a sudden, his arm broke. And the players in the dugout said, his teammates said, we could hear the crack, it was that loud. And they did an exam and realized the cancer was back, and it was now bone cancer. And he was going to have major surgery. His career now was over. He said he went into the hospital for the surgery, and he was in recovery, and he got up and he looked in the mirror, and he said, it looked like the whole left side of my body was gone. They had removed his arm, his shoulder, his collarbone. And he looked at himself, and he took a deep breath. And he said something that I've often remembered and said to myself in difficult situations. He said, okay, Lord, this is the hand that I have been dealt. Help me to face it. He went into a 2-year depression after that. But through counseling and the support of his family and friends, he recovered. And Dave Dravecki is still around. He's a motivational speaker. And I guess he's got something to talk about. He's 64 years old. He's still on the circuit. He's a strong follower of Christ. But those words, Lord, this is the situation I'm facing. Help me, help me. Help me to deal with it. Has meant a lot to me. Face the fears. And then the second thing is trace the fears. Take the time to figure out what it actually is that might be bothering you. We see that in this passage. Let me read the verses that David said when he was facing the fear. Let me just back up a bit. Verse 3 and 4, I skipped that. How long will you assault a man? Would all of you throw him down this leaning wall, this tottering fence? They fully intend to topple him, himself, me. They fully intend to topple me from his lofty place. He was not in denial. He knew it was coming, and he faced it. And then the second thing is trace your fears. So we see this. Why is David anxious? Well, look what he says in verse 9. Low-born men are but a breath. The high-born are but a lie. If weighed on a balance, they are nothing. Taken together, they are only a breath. David realizes his vulnerability. Though he has been the greatest king in the history of Israel and advanced the borders beyond what any king had ever done, he was fabulously wealthy and had a powerful army. He realizes he's like a breath, a vapor. He's so vulnerable, and that's the source of his anxiety. All of this could be over in a moment, he's realizing. When we are anxious, it's so important to figure it out. Why? What is bothering me? It may take time, but eventually you'll begin to understand there's something that is dark at the bottom of that fear and anxiety. It might be right now you're thinking about sickness, thinking about somebody who is maybe very sick. We realize that in a moment things can change, how vulnerable we are. Maybe some of you are facing some financial loss because of the virus. You're certainly facing changes. Maybe you haven't been able to see your grandkids. I know people that haven't seen their grandchildren since March. And things change very quickly, as with David, we realize our vulnerability. David goes to the source of that and realizes his fear. Many, many years ago, in fact, 1600 years ago, there was a great Christian thinker, Augustine, or Augustine, as he called variably, St. Augustine. And he lived about 400 years after Christ. And he was perhaps the greatest Christian thinker after the apostles. He helped us and really helps our understanding of the scriptures as we read them, and of the gospel, and of the meaning of the work of Christ on the cross and all of that. His understanding and teaching into it has shaped our thinking today, and we're not even aware of it. Augustine said something very clear and very vivid and very helpful about anxiety. This is what he said. Anxiety is the smoke from a collapsing idol. Let me say it again. Anxiety is the smoke from a collapsing or a burning idol. Let me kind of unpack that for a moment. Smoke and anxiety are alike in this way. They're both vaporous. Anxiety is often very vague. It's just bothering us and we don't know why. Smoke is vaporous. But where there's smoke, there's fire. You trace the smoke until you find out where the fire is. And with anxiety, trace the anxiety until you figure out what it is that's causing it. What's the idol that is collapsing? And an idol can be anything. Idols are usually good things. Idols can be our work. It can be our family, our marriage, our children, our grandchildren, our health, our church, our nation. All of these things can become idolatrous to us if they become the one thing instead of something. When they become the most important thing in our lives and not just one thing in our lives. Let me kind of unpack it this way a little bit. Anxiety comes when we realize that something that we have been counting on to give us happiness, to give us peace, to give us hope, to give us joy, to give us meaning in life, to give us security, something that we have been counting on to give us those things is threatened. And we become anxious. Right? Something that we have idolized, and we may lose that, and that causes us to be anxious. David realizes it. He says, my life is a breath. I've been counting on all of these things. I've been counting on my kingdom to give me honor, to give me glory, to give me power, to give me security. And now it's all threatened. I'm a vapor. And that produces anxiety. A number of years ago, I lost my cell phone. Any of you lost your cell phone? And my wife said, well, let me call it. And I said, don't bother. I remember turning it off. It was the days before, you had GPSs that, built-in tracks it. And so I called my kids, said, did I leave my phone at your apartments, your houses? And they said, I'll look. No, let me call it. Don't bother. I turned it off. And they said, well, Dad, try to remember where you last saw it, right? Is that what your mother always told you? Now, sometimes that's helpful, but often it's not. I couldn't remember. I mean, if I could remember, I would have found it. I couldn't remember where I'd lost it. And it bothered me. I couldn't sleep that night. And I'm thinking, why is this bothering me so much? I was restless, anxious. It wasn't, the cost of replacing it. I would have been able to do that. It wasn't even having to reconstruct all my contacts as the day before everything was stored. And so I would have had to go back and try to remember and put in all the phone numbers. It would have taken time, would have been a pain, but I would have done it. There's something more than that. And it took me a while, but sometime in the middle of the night, it dawned on me why it was bothering me. That was because I'd been careless. I had lost a little bit of control. And I realized the idol for me is control. I like to be in control. I'm like the Enterprise car rental, is that it? The guy who likes to be in control? The old character from Seinfeld, Putty. And I had to surrender that. I had to say, all right, God, I'm not in control. Right now, I am not in control. I don't know where that phone is, and I surrender it. That was my idol. Is there an idol that you need to trace? Trace the smoke. The smoke, and it's pointing to a fire somewhere. Find out what that fire is. All right. Face it, trace it, and then last of all, and here's the third rhyme, replace your fears in your idols. And this is the crux of the text. Look at what David writes in verses 1 and 2, 5, 6, 7. Let me read it. And notice how many times he says, God alone. My soul finds rest in God alone. My salvation comes from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation. He's my fortress, I'll never be shaken. Find rest, O my soul, in God alone. My hope comes from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation. He's my fortress, my salvation, my honor, my refuge. David replaces the idol with God alone. And I'm going to show you how he does that. And we see it in the other text that I read in the 2 Samuel passage. Look what David says, and I believe this is David's finest hour. Zadok, the high priest, says to David, let's bring the Ark of the Covenant with you as you flee the city. Because as you know, the Ark of the Covenant was the very presence of God. God obviously fills the universe, and they knew that. But his manifest presence, his felt and perceived presence, experienced presence, was there in the Ark and in the tabernacle until the temple was built. And Zadok says, we're going to take the Ark with us. That's our protection. That's God with us. And here's David's finest hour. His finest hour wasn't when he slew Goliath, wasn't when he became king, was anointed as king. His finest hour was this. Let me read it to you. David says, take the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it in his dwelling place again. But if he says, I am not pleased with you, then I am ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him. Can you imagine that? That is, I believe, David's finest moment, when there is the surrender of everything. He was going to lose his life, his family, his honor, his place in history. Everything was going to be lost, in all at the hands of his son. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine anything worse than that in life? And he says, all right, God, if this is the hand I've been dealt, help me face it. If this is your will, then I accept it. That's surrender. That's relinquishment. That's Gethsemane. That's Jesus saying, in this strange interaction, this mysterious dialogue that he had with his Father in the Garden of Gethsemane, God himself, the Son, in this discussion with God the Father, saying, if it's possible for me to not have to go through this, then let that happen. But not my will, but your will be done. In that moment of surrender. That's how we conquer anxiety. When we say to God, I'm afraid I'm going to lose this. I'm afraid this situation, this thing, whatever it is, this person that I need so much, that I've counted on, that I find my security in, I'm afraid I'm going to lose it. But nevertheless, your will be done. That's how we replace the idols in our life. And that, to me, is the hardest place to come to in our life as Christians. When we say, God, I really wanted that to happen, but evidently it's not going to happen. Help me to accept your will and to say, thy will be done. There's a little scene in the book, A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. It's the shortest of his books, so if you want to read one of his books, pick that one. It's about one day. And the lead character, Ivan Denisovich, is in a prison gulag in Siberia in the wintertime, slave labor camp. And there's a Christian in the barrack with him. And the one little light bulb is glowing. It's the end of their day. They've been out laboring all day in the frozen wilderness and waste of Siberia. And now they're in bed. And the Christian is reading his little tattered New Testament. And Ivan says to him, all the good in the world, that's done you. Look at you. You pray to God and you still get 25 years like everybody else. What good did it do you? Why don't you pray that your God lets you out of here? And many people think that the character of Ivan is autobiographical for Solzhenitsyn, who eventually, as you know, came to New England. He left the Soviet Union and lived in Cavendish, Vermont. And then he went back when the Soviet Union fell. But he became a Christian. His son still lives there. And I know a pastor who knows his son in Cavendish. And here's maybe the greatest novelist of the 20th century. And it's autobiographical because he became a Christian in the labor camps as he battled not only that, but he battled cancer. And God brought him through it all. And this is what the Christian says back to Ivan. He says, I don't pray that I'll be set free. I pray that God's will be done. And probably that was a real expression. And perhaps that's what converted Alexander Solzhenitsyn when he realized the power. Because when you can say that, then there's nothing that you need to be afraid of. How about us? How about us? Can we say, Jesus, you know what I want, but if that's not your plan, give me the grace to accept it. If the dream that I have never comes true, am I okay? Or do I refuse to be happy? If I never meet my soulmate, is that going to be all right? Is God the one thing, not just another thing? If I never have children, grandchildren, can I say, you alone, God, are enough? If my marriage is never really what I'd like it to be, is God able to fulfill me? If, and this is the ultimate, I never get well, is God truly my only and best hope? Can I surrender all my dreams and idols and still believe God is good and that no good thing he will withhold from those who love him, as Psalm 84 says? Listen to the conclusion that David comes to when he puts everything in God's hands. He says, finally, one thing God has spoken, two things I have heard, that you, O God, are strong, and that you, O Lord, are loving, and surely you will reward each person according to what he has done. David was able to, in that moment of surrender, realize that God is loving. He wants to bless our lives, not to take from us, and he's strong. He can bless our lives. He's not impotent or inept. And that's the conclusion we come to when we surrender the idol. We get peace because we know God is good. We know he's loving. We know he's powerful. So, what can we do? If something's bothering you, figure it out, face it, trace it down, and see it for the idol that it is. That it is some way, boy, they come in so easily, idols. And instead replace it with God alone. Put Jesus Christ as you yield yourself back. Maybe renew your faith, rededicate yourself to him. Or do what a friend of mine does, a very successful businessman. He's made a lot of money in his life, has a wonderful family and home, and strong follower of Christ. He's got a list in his Bible of all of his potential idols so that he can recognize them and head them off when they begin to grab hold of his soul. I don't know what it is. Maybe life is great right now. Praise God if it is. but if there's something troubling you, figure that out and surrender it, because there's an idol there. All right, God bless you.